Now to introduce our speaker, Reverend Dr. Scot Johnston. Dr. Johnston attended St. Olaf's College and Yale Divinity School and Princeton Theological Seminary for his education. On his church website, he has a section called Previous Gigs, which I liked, where you'll find that he was a pastor in Atlanta as well as a professor of homiletics at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Texas. He's currently the senior pastor at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian in Manhattan, lives near Central Park. He has numerous publications, most of which delve into the art and history of preaching. And since this morning we are in Sunday school together, his most recent book, Elusive Grace, Loving Your Enemies While Striving for God's Justice, seems very appropriate to mention. You can find this book, by the way, anywhere books are sold, but we have copies that we'll bring this evening. So as you hear what Scott is saying, if you want to hear more and more and more, there will be an opportunity to grab a book this evening and to have him sign it after his lecture. Pastor Laura and I were lucky enough to cross paths one time with Dr. Johnston in our earliest years in ministry in Greensboro, and I can say with pleasure that he's the real deal. Martin Luther King said the world needs people with hard heads and tender hearts, and I think Dr. Johnston has both in spades. So let's give Dr. Johnston a warm welcome.
Thank you. It is wonderful to be here with all of you today. Was this event for me, I'm trying to think about when we first started talking about this, because it was pre-COVID, and then I was scheduled to come, I think, in maybe 2020, in 2020, and so it's a 3-year delay. It's worth the wait. It's wonderful to be in Salisbury. It was great to get to meet Bob and to have conversation with him last night. It's a wonderful thing to endow a series like this in the name of a beloved senior pastor emeritus. Bob and I were talking somewhere over by the sausage biscuits a few minutes ago, and he said something that just, it's true. Pastors, when they leave a church, they're supposed to distance themselves, but that's hard because if it's gone well, you love the people, you love each other. And he was talking about that, and he said, I've been at a lot of different churches, but this one for me is Philippi. And if you read the New Testament, you know what that means. Paul, the Apostle Paul, he had good relationships with all these different congregations that he planted, but he loved the Philippians, and they loved him, and that comes through in that little letter in a beautiful way. It's an honor to be asked to come and speak at a series that has those underpinnings, those foundations. It's also an honor to be here with Laura and Josh. They're amazing. This is the sort of clergy that gives me hope for the Presbyterian Church. As Josh said about the youth last week, they're not the church's future, they're the church's now, and that's a really good thing to have two such bright bulbs in leadership. You're fortunate, very fortunate to have them. I've been asked to make one announcement. I understand that Laura and Josh will be doing special pastoral counseling session for those of you who are Tar Heels right after the service today. They didn't want you to feel too bad after last night's experience. So when I originally sent this title for the three things, which is Sunday school, worship, and then this evening's lecture, It had a question mark after it, "Fight like Jesus?" ? I've since taken the question mark out. It's out on the beautiful posters that you made and all your publicity. The question mark is there. That's my fault. It was in preparing to do this that I decided, no, it's not something that I'm really pondering whether or not we should fight like Jesus. I actually think we should fight like Jesus, and the question is, what does that mean? And that's sort of the trajectory, the arc that I want us to be on over the course of today, is to explore that question, what does it mean to fight like Jesus? We're going to kind of go at this. It's going to be about in 3 rounds, and this morning we're going to explore the roots of human conflict. How long do I have? When do you want me to wrap this up? 10:40. Okay. As Josh pointed out, I'm a former professor, so I can just keep going and going and going. So we're going to start by talking about the roots of human conflict this morning. At worship today, we're going to talk about choosing the right fight. I don't think that all conflict is good conflict. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. I think some of it's unnecessary, silly, a waste of time and energy, even sinful. So we're going to talk about that in worship today. What's the good conflict that we might want to be involved in? And then this evening, I'm going to talk about the how. How is it that followers of Christ should engage in conflict when that's the thing that we feel called to do? And so that's the journey that we're going to be on over the course of today. So let me just do a few preliminaries, and I apologize if this text is hard to read on the left-hand side there. But this is a mosaic from Venice, and it's, anybody know what that scene is? That's Jesus being tempted by the devil. This is the classic Jesus in the wilderness, and in conflict with the devil. This is the classic text that we read at the beginning of Lent. Jesus has been baptized by John, and he goes out into the wilderness, and Jesus engages in conflict. And so I use this to point out, some people are like, well, Jesus isn't into conflict. Well, actually, Jesus is into conflict all the time. Just about every story that you read in the Gospels has some kind of conflicted element to it, some kind of positions that are at odds with each other. And Jesus himself is driven by the Spirit, according to the Gospels, out into the wilderness to engage in this conflict with the devil. And so that's the beginning of his earthly ministry, is actually seeped in a kind of conflict with evil, if you will. My assumption over the course of the next 3 events is that revelatory things then can happen in conflicted moments. We can learn things about God and God's desires for us in conflicted moments. I actually think that that's true just if you were to step aside, if we were to be completely non-religious and theological, I think that we can learn things in conflicted times. And so I think that's a good place to start. At the same time, I think we are called to remember that Christ, to quote the Apostle Paul, has entrusted to us the ministry of reconciliation. So we're kind of holding these things in 2 hands, that conflict is something that people of faith are pulled into, find themselves in naturally, sometimes seek out, and that we are supposed to be reconcilers, reconciling people to each other and reconciling people to God. And so those are one more thing of preliminaries. As I was saying just a second ago, I don't think all conflict is good. In fact, I would argue that maybe most conflict is sort of messed up. And so I think it behooves us to ask, what are the roots of conflict? Where does conflict come from? When should we avoid conflict? What fights are worth having? And how, when a fight is worth fighting, we can fight like Jesus. So the roots of conflict. Human beings are deeply social. And what's amazing, just look at this room, look at Salisbury. Human beings are capable of incredibly intricate cooperation, world-changing actions moving together to do things. We have that capacity to work together, to make healthy change in society, in culture, in our own neighborhoods, in our own families. But we're also, again, this is the two-handed piece, we're also competitive, driven souls who are easily offended and often embrace anger and hatred toward those who offend us. So what is it that tips us into conflict? And Josh and Laura will tell you that when I did the event at First Pres Greensboro a number of years ago, the person that I was really into then was Charles Taylor. I've always seemed to have some philosopher or theologian that I'm really interested in. And as I've been thinking about this question about conflict and how should Christians engage in conflict well, I gravitated toward the work of this guy, René Noël Théophile Girard. Girard was born in Avignon, France in 1923. He had academic appointments. Carolina fans don't hold this against him. To Duke University, Bryn Mawr, Johns Hopkins, and he ended up his career at Stanford University out in California. He wrote on psychology, literature, philosophy, and theology. He was kind of a polyglot. He was just interested in all sorts of different things. He was a practicing Christian, but this came to him later in his life. He was around 40 years old when he converted to Christianity. He was an atheist before that. And then he had this conversion to Christianity. And he spent most of his academic career thinking out of a Christian perspective about conflict. And he wanted to really explore what are the roots of conflict. And he wrote 6 different major works on this subject, and they're fascinating. They're dense philosophically. He looks at conflict in literature, in psychology, and but to start all of his work on conflict, he turned to the 10 Commandments. So I want to talk about the 10 Commandments for just a minute and then get at why Girard found the 10 Commandments so important. Traditionally, scholars divide the 10 Commandments up into 3 sections. And the first section, Commandments 1, 2, and 3, all deal with God, who God is. And they are prohibitions against idolatry. They are encouragement to keep God's name holy. But the first 3 commandments are really about humanity and God. Now, many biblical and theological scholars use the first commandment or the first 2 commandments as a way to interpret all the rest. That's not what Girard does, but he does think it's important that it starts with 3 commandments about who God is. The next section in the 10 Commandments are Commandments 4 and 5. And these 2 commandments are what Girard calls commandments about how to live a good life. And to live a good life, you need to do 2 things. You need to keep the Sabbath, keep it holy, and follow the rhythms of a life that observes the Sabbath, that sets time aside for worship and contemplation of God, that takes rest seriously. So that's about how to live the good life. And then honor your father and mother. Pay attention to your familial relationships. care for those, and that's going to lead to a good life. So section 1 of the Ten Commandments is God. Section 2 is a good life. And then there's section 3. And section 3, often called the neighbor commandments or the thou shalt nots, section 3 focuses on the things that you should not do to your neighbor in order to stay on the holy path. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. And this is part of that final section, the last 5 commandments. All of this leads up to commandment number 10. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Gerard was drawn to the 10th commandment. He found the 10th commandment to be the most important commandment. In fact, he argued that you could read all the other commandments through the lens of the 10th commandment. And he argued you wouldn't even need commandments 6, 7, 8, or 9 if you obeyed the 10th. You see that? You see what he's saying? You wouldn't need 6, 7, 8, or 9 because if you obeyed the 10th. Does that make sense? Anybody? A few people nodding. Let me say more. You're not going to murder if you don't have a reason for murdering. And the reason for murdering is you want something. You're coveting. You're not going to commit adultery if you're not coveting. You're not going to steal. That's the easiest one to see, right? I'm not going to steal if I'm not coveting that thing. I'm not going to bear false witness against my neighbor if there's not something that I'm wanting to get out of diminishing my neighbor. And so Gerard's work, all those books that I talked about, this great teaching career, focuses on the 10th commandment. And human desire. And that's what I want to talk about this morning as we get into this question of, where does conflict come from? For Gerard, it all has to do with coveting, with desiring the wrong things. And so I want to talk about desire, the 10th commandment, and mimesis. Now, mimesis isn't a word that you see every day or hear every day. It's a funky Greek philosophical word. So I've asked these pigeons to help explain mimesis to us. What are other words for mimesis? Well, mimesis is a word that means mimicry, imitation. You can hear it in that. That's the root of mimicry, to mimic another, to imitate another. The root is mimesis, to impersonate, to parody, to do an impression, a forgery, a copy, a reflection, a clone. Human beings are, says Gerard, mimetic beings. We imitate each other all the time. We are adept at imitating each other. We like to imagine ourselves as others. Our desires, says Gerard, you think that your desire is yours? Says Gerard. It is not. Your desires are not unique to you. They are formed, they are borrowed, they are shaped by others. By peers. Just think of the way we talk about high school, how these young people are being shaped by their peers, and how we are often involved in conversations with them about how they long to be like this other person in their peer group. Maybe not even somebody that they like, curiously enough. They might long to be like. My church is 1 block from Madison Avenue. Madison Avenue is famous for shaping people's desires. If you ever watched that, anybody watch that show Mad Men? Anybody? Few of you. That whole show is about the advertising culture and how they are trying to shape people's desires for certain products. Today we don't talk about Madison Avenue so much, we talk about influencers. Who are influencers? So how many of you heard of the Kardashians? All right. More of you need to have heard of them, not for good reasons, but this is one experience that I had my third year in ministry. I've been in New York 15 years. Third year in ministry, I had a producer of that show, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, called the church and said, the Kardashian sisters want to come in and to worship on Sunday, and they'd like to light a candle in worship. I said, oh, why? They think it would look good. And I was like, the answer is no. They're like, no, seriously, we think it would be great publicity for your church. I said, no, what is it? It's a meaningless performative act. But influencing, trying to convince people, what to do with their lives, where to spend their money, that's a huge piece of mimesis, social media, of course. Gerard looked at all this and he said, the interesting thing about all of our desires is if you boil them down, he said, all desire is a desire for being. And that sounds kind of like fuzzy, but let me unpack that for a second. Deep down, Gerard said, we don't just desire other people's stuff, the ox and the ass, the spouse, the car, the house, the clothes, the jewelry. Deep down, we desire to be someone other than what we are. We desire to be another person. And that is, to Gerard, is the root of human conflict. We desire to be someone other than what we are. Now, you might be saying, well, I don't desire to be somebody other than I am. But what Gerard would say is every time you're like, oh, and you look with envy on somebody else, there's a little bit of that's coming into play, that desire to be different than who we actually are. So this is a longer quote. I'm going to read this to you, but I think because this in some ways is one of the most accessible ways to get at what Gerard's talking about. We want what others want. We want it because they want it. And these desires are shaped by our constant imitation of others. And when the coveted goods are scarce, these desires pit us against one another on an individual level, on a community level, and on a global scale as well. Coveting causes divorces, and it causes international wars. It causes children to fight over a $5 toy in a sandbox. Coveting convinces us that others have what we need. Coveting convinces us that we're just one step away from feeling satisfied, secure, and happy about our place in this world. If I just won the lottery, then I'd be happy. And this to Gerard is why that 10th commandment explains all the other sins. In fact, if you think of all the deadly sins, wrath, envy, jealousy, lust, greed, they all come from the 10th commandment. The Ten Commandments deals with all of the classic sins that the church has talked about for millennia. This painting here by Ford Madox Brown is this fantastic painting of Joseph's brothers bringing the coat of many colors back after they've sold their brother into slavery and rubbed the blood on the coat to try to explain to their father, that's Jacob in the big white flowing beard there, why it is, what happened. And I think it's just like, I could have gone with Cain and Abel, but this is, I think, one of these rudimentary core stories of the faith, of the tension between Joseph and his brothers. And it's a story of coveting in a way. You might say it's envy or jealousy, and those are all just subsets of coveting. And according to Girard, it is our misplaced desires that lead humans to commit all these other sins, and eventually misplaced desire turns violent. And Girard, at this point, argues that there's two trajectories that human beings tend to go once their misplaced desire builds up to an unhealthy place. They go to war, armed conflict, or they go to scapegoating, many putting the ills, the misplaced, the anger over desires that have not been realized on a single person. And the examples that I use here are, of course, the war in Ukraine, which to me, is there a clear example? Listen to Putin and the reasons he gives for this conflict, right? There's nothing there, nothing under, right, wipe out fascism. There's nothing underneath that but just cold-blooded desire. And hundreds of thousands of people are dying in Ukraine because of that. It's amazing what coveting can do and how much it can motivate people. And you could dig deeper into this, into what's happening in Russia itself and what is being, okay, we've got a war going. What is the desire of the Russian people? You can play with that, spin it out. Tyree Nichols, I think we're a ways away from completely understanding what happened there. But it wouldn't surprise me if where we come down with all that is that this was scapegoating, pure and simple. This was taking out your own anger and frustrations on somebody who is the same skin color as the cops who beat him to death. And why? Girard would say that underneath this is, once again, desires that are not finding a way to be appropriately satisfied. So, what are we going to do with all this? I'm going to take a pivot now away from Girard for a minute. And what is the Christian going to do with all the conflict that we find in the world? And let's not talk about it. Let's not consider what happened in Memphis or what's happening in the Ukraine or what's happening in our own families, our own communities that has got us doing this. And of course, that is not where I'm heading. We're not going to be ostriches. Although I read up, preparing to do this, ostriches are not actually trying to hide from conflict when they stick their head in the ground. They're digging. They're digging a burrow for their eggs. So it's kind of not fair to ostriches, but it's it's an old metaphor, so we'll just kind of roll with it for a second. I want us to turn to a part of the Christian tradition. I think this is a move that I'm going to explore a little bit now and then more this evening. what is positive in terms of desire? Is all desire bad? And where in the Christian faith do we find people talking about good aspects of desire? And quite frankly, I think the place is sort of an odd place. It's a place that modern Christians don't often find themselves, is Christian mystics. And the mystic tradition in Christian history is deep and long, and many would argue that Jesus was a mystic. What is a mystic? A mystic is somebody who talks about having direct experiences of God or the Spirit, and who conveys those to others. A mystic is often somebody whose life is then shaped by those direct experiences of God. And oftentimes we are more, okay, let's think about God, let's read the scripture text, which we're going to do in a few minutes here. Let's process other people's experience of God and see whether or not that squares with ours. That's a lot of the way in which contemporary churches do it, and that's the way I do it every week. But mystics are spending their time talking about having experienced God that morning while they were down on their knees in prayer. Some of the most famous mystics, the Desert Fathers and Mothers. There's this guy I love whose name is Abba Moses. Actually, it's Abba Moses the robber. He was one of those covetous souls who broke away from that and went out to the desert to find Jesus. The Franciscans, St. Francis of Assisi himself was a mystic. The Beguines, I'm going to talk more about the Beguines in a second. I know, how many of you heard of the Beguines? No. See, nobody's heard of the Beguines. The Beguines are in Germany and are a fascinating medieval group of women who had spiritual experiences and wrote about them. And we're gonna look at one, Mechthid, in a second. Julian of Norwich, many people have heard of her. So what do mystics know about desire, specifically about the positive side of desire? If so much about desire is getting us in trouble, is there a good strain of desire, and what does that look like? And the mystics are the ones, I think, that can point us in the direction of a positive kind of desire. And it seems kind of funny always. People get a little, how do I want to put this? They get a little, this is weird when they start reading Christian mystics, because the Christian mystics in their writings, they would talk about love for God in ways that make people uncomfortable. Like it starts to sound more like they're writing a romantic letter to God, a love letter. It makes people uncomfortable. They're like, I don't want to feel that way about Jesus. But that's what the mystics do. There's this kind of, all my heart is consumed with wanting to become closer to know you better, to indwell you, to appreciate you. I want you to rule over every aspect of my life. It's just like they're really, really into God and Jesus, the mystics. And so I want to take a look at Mechthild of Magdeburg. She lived in the 1200s. She was a German woman who was born to a wealthy family. And she began having spiritual visions, she said, when she was 12 years old. When she was 12 years old, she had a vision of the Holy Spirit in her bedroom. And these visions were so powerful to her that she left. Now, this was in the 1200s. This would have been viewed by 99% of the people in this room, including me. If my daughter came to me and said, I'm having spiritual visions and I'm leaving and I'm going to go and join a community of people who are living in shacks, somewhere in Minnesota, and that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to care for the poor and sick, I would say, okay, honey, you need to rethink this. But she did it. She left. And she joined this community that care for the poor and the sick. And she wrote about it, and she wrote a little book that we have pieces of it that survived over the years. It's called The Flowing Light. And in the book, she speaks of the God-hunting heart. And I find this concept to be captivating, interesting, something I want to know more about. What does it mean to have a heart that's looking for God all the time? All the time. Not just when you're in church, but when you're in the grocery store, when you're filling up your tank at the supermarket, when you're watching the news. What does it mean to have a heart that's hunting for God? And that's a sort of desire, a kind of holy desire. And this is a quote from Macfield. The soul is made of love and must ever strive to return to love. Therefore, it can never find rest nor happiness in other things. It must lose itself in love. I think that may be the scariest line in this quote. It must lose itself in love. By its very nature, it must seek God, who is love. There's this deep, all-in commitment that we see in the mystics, and a desire to draw closer to and to find oneself immersed in, surrounded by, swimming in a sort of love for God. What does it mean to desire God? So I'm going to end with this, and this is, I want to first start by saying, again, thank you to you all for issuing this invitation to me. Josh mentioned my book, Elusive Grace, and the biggest question that I've been getting out of that book was, okay, tell us more what we need to do. Give us more concrete things that we need to do out of what you've suggested here. And so as I was thinking about coming and doing the Lewis series, I started thinking, I think there may be a second book here. And I think the book is going to be called Fight Like Jesus. And I think at the heart of it is to start, before I get to, which I'm going to do tonight, the very concrete things I think we need to do. I think we need to talk about an attitude that needs to come over us, and that attitude is to desire God, and not all the other things that the Ten Commandments warns us against. And so I want to read this little section that I've written about that. Desire God, what does that mean? Christian mystics often describe their longing for God as a process, as a relationship that grows and deepens from friendship into love. To love God, to desire God, is to want what God wants. To desire God is to be shaped by God's grace, by God's loving embrace. To desire God is to abandon tactics that deepen human conflict. It's to speak with love, humility, and vulnerability. It's to try and fail again. In fact, the Apostle Paul warns believers about this. The world will see you, he says, as being weak and foolish, as being the followers of a perpetual failure, i.e., Jesus. This happens, my friends, because those who desire God are learning to play the game of life according to an entirely different set of rules. The goal of this game is not to satisfy your heart's latest desire at whatever cost. The goal of this game is to have your heart's desires shaped by another, by a love that is so vast, so deep, so broad, so high. What's the alternative? There isn't one. The only thing that can save us from misplaced desire is God. God alone can free us because God alone does not covet. The reverse of coveting, the opposite of trying to obtain things for yourself, is giving. The opposite of coveting is offering yourself sacrificially to others. And that is who God is. In the next two sessions at worship and tonight, we will try to explore what this God asks of us. Do you want to do questions? Yeah.
Laura, would you mind grabbing a mic over there for? Thank you so much. Much to chew on already. We only have a little time for questions, but I do want to open it up if there's any questions you have for Scott about what he's just presented to us, the mystics and desire and all the rest. Sarah, yeah.
I was thinking about positive desire, and clarify for me, I think as a Christian, I look at other Christians and sometimes I desire their faith and their commitment and their relationship to God that maybe is deeper than mine. So is that positive, or am I coveting, or both?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. What does it mean to covet somebody else's faith? Yeah. What I would say is, and Gerard allows for this. Gerard doesn't think that all desire is bad. He thinks that most desire is bad, and it gets corrupted, and it's like, I was telling Josh last night, he asked me what I was listening to, and I thought he was asking me about like podcasts, but he was wanting to know music, and I'm going to get to music tonight. But I've been listening to the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis, a book on tape as I walk back and forth to work. I love that book. What's fascinating in that book is, and if you haven't read it, you should. It's a series of letters that a demon, Screwtape, writes to his nephew, Wormwood, about how to tempt human beings and how to pull them to the side of the father below, Satan. And it is a fascinating kind of exploration of human desire gone amok. And Gerard, I don't know if he ever read the Screwtape Letters, but I think he would agree that it is very easy for our desires to become messed up and to control us. I honestly, this is not, I'm not trying to put myself up on a higher plane here. This is what I think about all the time as I process my own inner life of faith. What is it that I want? And is my want being shaped by other people or the desire to be other people? That's sort of sad, right? It's sad to think that so many people want to be somebody other than who they are. And Gerard says that is just a tragedy. And so if he's right, if that's a controlling thing within societies and cultures, this desire to be something different, or this unquenched desire that always sees something out there as the thing that's going to make me happy. If I find myself in that, I know that there's something wrong. And sometimes it's really hard to get out of that. But I'm taking your question seriously because I think there is a kind of desire that is healthy, and that is saying, what does God want? Now, right back to your question, it could be that looking and saying, I would like to be more like Mechthild of Magdeburg, whose love for God is profound. It just kind of oozes out of her. And it's scary, though, to step in that direction. I think it really is. Honestly, very scary. It puts a lot at risk in our own lives.
See Carl and then Glenn.
I taught a course in interpersonal communication, and one of the areas that we covered was conflict. Interestingly, they had conflict that there were 13 of them listed, going all the way from one-on-one to hemisphere against hemisphere. And you can see how that would grow. But I'm surprised still that at no place in that list of 13 is religion against religion. How we think of another religion, not denomination, another religion. Where would you put that? How high up on that ladder of conflict would you put religion versus religion?
So that is a fabulous question, Carl. And my answer to that is the sermon I'll preach in about 30 minutes. It's going to come up in there. I'm going to mention that in I think, a clear manner. And if you don't feel like I've answered it by the time it's all over, you come and whack me upside the head after the service.
Glenn, yep.
Thanks for the opportunity. I have some notes here. I want to see if I can say what I intend to instead of talking forever. I was in a meeting encouraged by our clergy called All Ins. I heard all in your statements. And I heard inclusion in the suggestion that the love that replaces covetousness may suggest that diversity is something to be desired, that if we're going to be successful in the church in this time and to love everyone, that things like what I heard you had talked about with your colleague from Jamaica, Queens. The church would be pressing issues like racism, homelessness, immigration, health care, economic opportunity, opiate addiction. All of these suggest a huge need for love. And I heard in that review of a CNN description of your intention to a person of note. I think a demonstration that your congregation and your colleagues' congregation were trying to be unconditionally loving. That may be more specific than you want to address, but I long for churches in our time to be laboratories of diversity and inclusion, where everybody counts and where we honor the positives in our differences and work towards solutions to these things that you and your colleagues suggested on CNN were things that you were about.
Yes. Thank you. And thank you for your close reading. You're correct. Let me make two quick responses that are sort of different, but I think touch on the two of the things that you were saying, Glenn. The first is this. Glenn's referring to the fact that one of the Elusive Grace book starts out describing Patrick O'Connor, who's the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Jamaica, Queens, and I going and praying with Donald Trump right after he was elected in 2016. Trump's tower is catty corner across the street from the church. But there was a deeper reason, which actually I don't think I talk about in the book, that we went. Trump was baptized as a Presbyterian at First Presbyterian Church in Jamaica, Queens, and that's the church. My parents, or my grandparents, my father's parents are immigrants from Scotland, and that was their church. And Trump's mother was Presbyterian, and so my father grew up with Donald Trump, and Patrick is the pastor of that church now. The irony is that church, the irony given many of Trump's political stances, that church is now, it's almost entirely Afro-Caribbean Presbyterians, because that's the way Queens is. Queens keeps changing. We talked about Queens a little bit last night. It's the most diverse urban area in the world, 110 different languages spoken there. See, you got me going here, Glenn. But I took a lot of flack from people for praying with Trump. And I learned a lot from the flack, but people were like, how could you go and pray with a sinner? And I was like, what? Because that's all I do. I mean, I don't want to surprise anybody, but the things that I hear in my office are not like necessarily worse than the stuff that you see on the political news. So the idea that pastors could get tainted by talking to somebody like that, I thought that was wrong-headed. And so that's sort of where the book begins. It's trying to find a place for that. On your comment about diversity, I'll tell you the really super quick story and then I'll be done. And it's this. It's Jesus. Look at the disciples. Amongst the disciples, you have Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot. Jesus tapped these people. You could not find in our society today, you took the farthest right-leaning MAGA Republican and the farthest left-leaning AOC liberal and put them in the same room, they would not be as much at odds as Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector. Simon the Zealot hated the Romans. He thought that everything about the Romans, why was he a zealot? Because the Romans needed to be cast out violently. And his hope, I believe Simon the Zealot's hope is that Jesus is going to lead a violent revolution to throw the Romans out of Israel. Matthew the tax collector works for the flippin' Romans. That's where he gets his money. That's how he pays his kid's child tuition to college. That's what's putting the bread on his table. They would have viewed each other as not just enemies, but as threats to their existence. Like if there were anybody in the disciples that wanted to murder each other, it would have been Matthew and Simon. And yet Jesus says, come follow me. And puts them together in the 12. What does that say to you about diversity? It says that is something that Christ prioritizes above all. and that there is something that helps trump that difference. And I believe that happens to be desire for God. That's what helps Matthew and Simon coexist. Because it's not about agreement on the politics of the day that allows them to sit next to each other at the Last Supper. It's about wanting to be close to Jesus. And he's reorienting their entire way of looking at the world. And again, that is risky.
Good stuff. I think